October 24, 1944. The dawn over the Philippine Sea bled red with fire. Off the coast of Samar, waves shattered against steel as Japanese shells screamed across the horizon. The sea boiled with chaos, smoke, and rising plumes of black oil. The mighty battleships of Vice Admiral Kurita's center force bore down on a ragged line of American escort carriers, small, fragile vessels that the Japanese had once dismissed as little more than floating targets. Their decks were thin, their armor negligible, and their speed laughable compared to fleet carriers. The Imperial Navy had mocked them, writing them off as baby flattops, mere auxiliaries to ferry aircraft from one base to another. Yet, on this morning, these very ships stood between the most powerful surface fleet Japan had assembled since Pearl Harbor and the vulnerable invasion forces at Leyte Gulf. And somehow, impossibly, the outcome of the Pacific War itself was about to hinge on them. The first shells landed like sledgehammers. Geysers of water rose alongside the USS Gambier Bay, one of 6 escort carriers in Taffy 3, as sailors scrambled to stations. The horizon was filled with silhouettes that seemed torn from a nightmare. Giant pagoda masts, massive gun barrels, and armored behemoths gliding forward. Among them was the Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, her 18.1-inch guns capable of obliterating a carrier with a single direct hit. Yet facing them was a line of ships that had never been meant for frontline combat. They were slower, lightly armed, and carried only a handful of Wildcats and Avengers. The math should have been simple. The Japanese should have crushed them in minutes. But as the first salvo echoed across the Pacific, something unexpected began to unfold. The escort carriers turned into the wind, their decks already alive with frantic activity. Crews worked at breakneck speed, launching every plane they could, armed or not. Some aircraft roared into the sky carrying only machine gun ammo or depth charges, weapons designed for submarines, not battleships. Yet every pilot knew the truth. Delay the enemy, or the invasion at Leyte would be annihilated. The Japanese had expected sheep. Instead, they had stumbled upon wolves prepared to fight to the last breath. Smoke poured from destroyers as they surged forward to screen the carriers. Tiny against the looming cruisers and battleships, these destroyers began laying smoke screens so thick they turned the sea into a ghostly fog. Torpedo crews prepared their weapons, knowing most would not survive. The USS Johnston, under Commander Ernest Evans, darted from cover and charged directly at the Japanese line, guns blazing, torpedoes armed. His ship shuddered under the fury of return fire, but he pressed on, his crew stunned by his audacity. Evans shouted over the roar of explosions, "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way." And with that, the Johnston fired her torpedoes into a force 10 times her size. The Japanese gunners fired relentlessly, their shells arcing across the sky like fiery comets. Escort carrier decks splintered, planes ignited, men were thrown into the sea. Yet every minute that Taffy 3 group held was a minute bought for the invasion force at Leyte. The Japanese had come expecting easy prey. Instead, confusion spread through their ranks. How could such insignificant ships fight with such ferocity? How could they maneuver with such coordination, striking and fading, as though part of a larger, invisible fleet? As the battle raged, the carriers themselves transformed. Aircraft that had taken off with almost no ordnance circled back, reloaded with whatever could be strapped beneath their wings, and dove again into the storm. Avengers carried depth charges, Wildcats strafed battleship decks, and pilots made repeated suicide runs against ships bristling with anti-aircraft fire. The Japanese formations began to fracture. Reports clashed, commanders hesitated, and the once mighty center force stumbled in uncertainty on Gambier Bay. Sailors fired the carrier's single 5-inch gun in desperation, sending shells arcing against cruisers that dwarfed them. Each hit was a pinprick, but each pinprick sowed doubt in the enemy. One by one, destroyers fell silent, gutted by Japanese fire. Yet even as they sank, they bought the carrier's precious moments to keep launching aircraft. Survivors floated in burning oil, raising fists toward the enemy, screaming defiance into the wind. The scene was chaos, but also something else, an impossible resistance that grew larger than the sum of its fragile parts. By mid-morning, the sea was littered with burning wrecks. The Japanese had sunk the Gambier Bay, the Johnston, the Hull, and the Samuel B. Roberts. The cost for the Americans was devastating. Yet still, the Japanese advance slowed. Confusion grew within their command structure. Kurita himself, watching the chaos unfold, hesitated. Reports told him he was fighting not a handful of escort carriers, but perhaps an entire U.S. fleet. Pilots, with reckless courage, circled above, making repeated fake attack runs even after their weapons were expended, creating the illusion of overwhelming air power, the mockery that Japanese admirals had once voiced. The derision of baby flattops was unraveling before their eyes. These ships, never meant for battle, had clawed at giants and bled them. What should have been an easy slaughter had turned into a nightmare of smoke, torpedoes, and relentless air attacks. The Japanese, unnerved and uncertain, made the unthinkable decision to retreat. The mightiest surface fleet Japan had sent to sea since Pearl Harbor turned away, beaten not by carriers of steel and armor, but by carriers of grit, courage, and improvisation. In that moment, the mockery of escort carriers was silenced forever. They had proven themselves not auxiliaries but warriors, their fragile frames masking a resilience born of desperation and duty. Their sacrifice ensured that MacArthur's invasion of the Philippines would succeed, that the liberation of the islands would proceed, and that Japan's last hope of turning the tide would crumble. The waves closed over wreckage. Oil fires drifted on the wind. Survivors clung to life rafts, their faces blackened with soot, their eyes fixed on the horizon where the Japanese fleet had vanished. And in those smoldering seas lay the truth of modern war. Size and power meant nothing without the will to fight, the ingenuity to adapt, and the courage to defy the impossible. The world had just witnessed the day when tiny escort carriers, once mocked as insignificant, stood against the greatest battleships on Earth. In WWII 1944, the Pacific had become a graveyard of empires. For 3 years, the Japanese Navy had ruled these waters with an iron fist, sweeping across Asia and striking with ferocity at Pearl Harbor, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. Their battleships and carriers had seemed unstoppable, their admirals supreme tacticians of a new form of war. Yet time, attrition, and the industrial might of the United States were beginning to erode that dominance. The once proud fleet that had sailed victorious in 1941 was now fractured. Exhausted and desperate, the tide had turned with Midway in June 1942, when 4 Japanese fleet carriers were lost in a single morning. After that, the Americans pressed relentlessly, grinding through Guadalcanal, the Solomons, and the Central Pacific. Each battle chipped away at the core of Japan's experienced aviators, replacing veterans with hastily trained recruits. Still, the Imperial Navy remained formidable. Its battleships, cruisers, and heavy guns were unmatched in raw power. And in the autumn of 1944, with the U.S. landing in the Philippines, Japan prepared to gamble everything in one last decisive stroke. The Philippines was more than just islands on a map. They were the gateway to Japan's empire in Southeast Asia. Through their waters flowed the lifeline of oil from Borneo and Sumatra, the resource that kept the Japanese war machine alive. General Douglas MacArthur's return to the Philippines was not just symbolic. It threatened to choke Japan's fuel supply, starve its navy, and cut the empire in half. Japan's high command knew this. The combined fleet's plan, codenamed Shogo, was conceived as a desperate gamble to annihilate the invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf and cripple American momentum. The strategy was audacious. 3 separate Japanese task forces would converge on the Philippines from different directions. The Northern Force, a decoy of mostly empty carriers under Admiral Gisaburo Ozawa, would lure the powerful American Third Fleet away. The Southern Force would push through Surigao Strait, while the Central Force, under Kurita, would smash through the San Bernardino Strait and fall upon the invasion fleet at Leyte. If all went as planned, American transports and supply ships, thousands of them, would be destroyed in a cataclysm that might delay U.S. victory by years. But war rarely goes according to plan. American intelligence had cracked Japanese codes. Submarines lay in wait along the sea lanes. On October 23, in the Palawan Passage, Kurita's Central Force suffered a devastating blow as the submarines USS Darter and USS Dace tore into his formation. The heavy cruiser Atago, Kurita's flagship, was sunk within minutes. Two more cruisers, Maya and Takao, were crippled or destroyed. Kurita himself was plucked from the sea, shaken but alive, and transferred his flag to Yamato. Already, the element of surprise was slipping away. Despite the losses, the center force pressed on. On October 24th, at the sea beyond sea, American carrier planes struck with a fury unseen since Midway. Bombs rained down on Musashi, Yamato's sister ship. Over the course of the day, Musashi absorbed 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs, her massive frame finally rolling beneath the waves. Yet the Japanese battleships kept advancing. Kurita withdrew briefly, convincing Admiral William Bull Halsey that the threat had passed. This was the opening the Japanese needed. As Kurita regrouped, the northern forces' decoy carriers appeared to the north. Halsey, a man of aggressive instinct, took the bait. With nearly his entire Third Fleet, he charged northward, eager to annihilate Japan's remaining carriers once and for all. It was a masterstroke of deception. The stage was set. Kurita's battleships would emerge from the San Bernardino Strait into the teeth of lightly defended escort carriers, Taffy groups guarding the invasion beaches. If Kurita succeeded, Leyte Gulf would become a slaughterhouse. The Americans had not expected this. Escort carriers were never designed to fight capital ships. They were born of necessity, constructed quickly on merchant hulls to provide air cover for convoys and amphibious forces. They carried about 24 planes, compared to nearly 100 on fleet carriers. Their top speed was just 19 knots, far slower than the 30-knot sprint of Japan's cruisers. Armor was thin, guns few, and decks short. Naval historians once likened them to eggshells armed with hammers. Valuable in support roles. Yes, but in a stand-up fight against the Yamato, Nagato, and a swarm of heavy cruisers, they were hopelessly outclassed. Yet it was here, in this imbalance, that fate played its cruelest trick. For Kurita did not stumble upon a major U.S. fleet as he feared. He encountered Taffy 3, just 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. A force that should have been swept aside like driftwood before a tidal wave. But by the autumn of 1944, American naval doctrine had evolved beyond steel and gun calibers. Coordination, improvisation, and the relentless courage of sailors would soon transform weakness into strength. In Japanese war councils, escort carriers were scorned. They were not the elegant strike carriers of Pearl Harbor, nor the majestic battleships revered as symbols of imperial pride. They were auxiliaries, workhorses, and tools of logistics. Japanese admirals, steeped in the traditions of decisive battle doctrine, viewed them as irrelevant to the clash of fleets. Their very existence was underestimated, their potential misunderstood. And that blind spot would prove catastrophic. The irony was brutal. While Japan clung to visions of battleships deciding the war, the United States had embraced something different: mass production, adaptability, and above all, the doctrine of combined arms. Escort carriers, though small, were countless. By 1944, over 100 of them roamed the Pacific, covering landings, protecting convoys, and extending the reach of American air power into every corner of the ocean. They were the silent scaffolding upon which the Allied advance was built. Japan could not match them in numbers, nor could its war industry keep pace. When Kurita's fleet burst from the San Bernardino Strait at dawn on October 25th, it was not the mighty Essex-class carriers or the fast battleships of Halsey's fleet that stood in his way. It was the very ships his peers had ridiculed, the jeep carriers of Taffy 3. 6 fragile decks, guarded by a handful of destroyers, facing a fleet of giants. The stage was set for one of the most improbable confrontations in naval history, where mockery would turn to disbelief and disbelief to defeat. The Japanese believed they had cornered their prey. Yet in the crucible of Leyte Gulf, a new reality was about to unfold, one that would shatter their assumptions, reshape naval warfare, and prove that in the Pacific War, no ship was too small, no crew too humble. To alter the fate of empires, the Japanese had always believed in decisive force, massive ships, massive guns, and massive battles. In their doctrine, naval power was measured in displacement, in the thunder of heavy shells, and in the grandeur of battleships that could level cities with a single broadside. Escort carriers, by contrast, were small, ugly, utilitarian things. Their very design was an insult to the traditions of sea power. They lacked speed, they lacked armor, and their aircraft wings were pitiful compared to the Essex-class giants that roamed the Pacific. To Japanese eyes, they were nothing but ferries, carriers in name only. Yet what the Japanese failed to understand was that the Americans had given these humble ships something far more lethal than steel: coordination. When Kurita's battleships bore down upon Taffy 3, the Japanese expected chaos. They expected the Americans to scatter, to panic, to die quickly. Instead, the escort carriers moved as if they were extensions of one another, their destroyer screens weaving smoke screens in perfect synchronization, their planes launching in rapid succession as if part of a rehearsed ballet. To the Japanese, it seemed impossible that such a ragtag group could fight with the discipline of a fleet many times its size. They could not see the invisible web binding the Americans together. Radio. For Japan, radio communications in 1944 were still riddled with problems: static, interference, and limited range. Japanese commanders often relied on signal flags or runners within their ships. Fleet-wide coordination was slow, hesitant, and vulnerable to confusion. The Americans, however, had invested heavily in frequency-modulated FM radios that cut through the noise of battle like a blade. With them, every destroyer, every carrier, and every plane in Taffy 3 could talk, share, and adapt. When a destroyer spotted the Japanese line, that information was instantly transmitted across the entire formation. When a pilot ran out of bombs, he could be ordered back into the fight with machine guns, or even just to strafe and harass. This invisible lattice of communication turned 6 escort carriers into something far larger: a living, breathing organism of war. The Japanese couldn't grasp it. Their doctrine still centered on individual initiative and rigid orders. In the fog of battle, their mighty ships often acted as isolated titans, each fighting its own duel rather than as part of a coordinated whole. In contrast, the Americans, with their radios buzzing across the airwaves, seemed to anticipate every move, reinforcing each other, covering gaps, and pressing attacks in waves that looked far larger than they were. What the Japanese dismissed as auxiliaries had, in fact, become nodes in a deadly network. But radios alone were not the hidden advantage. There was something more subtle, more profound at play. The Americans had embraced improvisation as a weapon. When escort carrier pilots roared into the sky that morning, many carried nothing more than depth charges or machine gun ammo. Against battleships, such weapons were laughable. Yet the order went out: attack anyway. Harass, confuse, distract. Pilots obeyed, diving at cruisers with weapons meant for submarines, strafing bridges, firing into gun crews, and forcing the Japanese to flinch and maneuver. Every moment of hesitation delayed the advance. Every false impression of strength fed into Kurita's growing doubts. To the Japanese commanders watching from Yamato's bridge, it seemed impossible. Why were they being swarmed with aircraft in such numbers? Why did the carriers they faced fight with the coordination of an entire task force? Their scouts had reported only a handful of escort carriers, yet the sky was thick with planes, the sea churning with torpedo wakes. They assumed they had stumbled upon a major American fleet. They had no idea that the majority of U.S. carriers were chasing Ozawa's decoy hundreds of miles away. The hidden advantage was not firepower. It was deception born of desperation, amplified by communication, and executed with uncanny precision. On the surface, the destroyers revealed another truth. American destroyers, though outgunned, had torpedoes of terrifying lethality. The Japanese knew of American torpedoes but underestimated their effectiveness. At Samar, they learned the hard way. The Johnston, the Hull, and the Samuel B. Roberts charged forward with suicidal courage, firing spreads of torpedoes that forced Japanese cruisers and battleships to veer off course. Even when the torpedoes missed, the psychological effect was immense. Suddenly, formations broke apart, precision dissolved, and the Japanese line lost its cohesion. What looked like madness was, in fact, controlled chaos. Small ships buying survival with audacity. Above, the aircraft reinforced the illusion of strength. Wildcats without bombs made mock strafing runs, diving again and again to convince Japanese gunners they faced endless waves. Avengers dropped depth charges that exploded with spectacular sprays, imitating heavy bombs. Every trick added to the deception. Kurita's staff, listening to frantic reports, believed they were under attack by full-sized fleet carriers. The reality was a handful of escort carriers improvising their way through hell. It was a profound mismatch of doctrines. Japan had placed faith in the power of capital ships, in the decisive blow of gunnery and armor. The United States had placed faith in flexibility, in numbers, and in the ability to connect every vessel and every plane into a seamless fighting whole. The Japanese mocked the escort carriers because they judged them by steel alone. They could not see the invisible force that made them lethal. Connectivity, communication, and improvisation. As the battle dragged on, Kurita's hesitation grew. Reports conflicted. His men swore they faced far more carriers than possible. The Americans, though bleeding and burning, never broke formation, never gave the impression of collapse. They fought as if they were the tip of a vast, unseen fleet. And Kurita, blinded by the hidden advantage of American coordination, began to falter. This was the secret weapon of the escort carriers. Their greatest strength was not what they carried on deck, but what they carried in spirit and in doctrine. Radios that allowed a dozen ships to fight as 100. Pilots willing to attack with nothing but courage. Destroyers willing to sacrifice themselves to protect fragile decks. Japanese admirals had mocked them, dismissed them, and underestimated them. But on the morning of October 25th, the baby Flattops revealed that in modern war, connection and adaptability mattered more than size or prestige. That it was a truth the Japanese would realize too late. By the time Kurita withdrew, retreating from what he believed to be overwhelming American power, the myth of escort carrier weakness was dead. They had fought giants with ingenuity and grit, and won. The escort carrier was never meant to be a warship of glory. Its birth came not from grand design, but from necessity. In 1940 and 1941, as U-boats stalked the Atlantic and the Pacific loomed with uncertainty, the United States Navy needed a way to project air power quickly and cheaply. Fleet carriers like the Yorktown or Enterprise took years to build, required vast resources, and demanded shipyards already straining under the load of battleships and cruisers. The solution was pragmatic. Take merchant hulls, oilers, transports, freighters, and convert them into small aircraft carriers. They were awkward hybrids, ungainly silhouettes with flat tops welded onto cargo ship frames. Yet within their limitations lay a quiet revolution. Each escort carrier displaced around 8,000 to 10,000 tons, barely a third of a fleet carrier. Their speed was modest, 17 to 19 knots at best, powered by converted merchant engines. Armor was practically non-existent. A single well-placed shell could tear them apart. Their flight decks were shorter, just long enough for takeoffs and landings if the wind was favorable. Most carried around 28 aircraft, usually a mix of FM, 2 Wildcats for fighter cover and TBM Avengers for strike roles. In contrast, the Essex-class fleet carriers bristled with nearly 100 planes, could reach over 30 knots, and were wrapped in layers of protection. By every traditional metric, the escort carriers were the weaker sibling, yet engineering genius transformed weakness into strength. The smaller flight decks meant operations had to be efficient. Catapults were installed to hurl fighters into the sky despite the short runways. Deck crews drilled relentlessly, turning rearming and refueling into a science of seconds. Below decks, hangar spaces were stripped for maximum storage, packing in spare parts and fuel. Everything about the escort carrier screamed economy, speed of production, and adaptability. By 1943, American shipyards were launching escort carriers in astonishing numbers. The Kaiser yards, famous for Liberty ships, could deliver a Casablanca-class escort carrier every few weeks. Ultimately, 50 Casablancas and dozens of Bogue-class and Sangamon-class carriers flooded the seas. Quantity became a weapon in itself. For every fleet carrier Japan launched, America launched 10 escort carriers. Where the Japanese clung to the idea of quality and prestige, the Americans embraced mass and flexibility, but numbers alone were not what made the escort carriers decisive. Technology gave them a hidden bite. Their radios, the SCR-522 and other FM systems, allowed them to maintain constant communication with destroyer screens, with aircraft overhead, and even with other task groups miles away. In contrast, Japanese carriers relied on AM sets prone to static, limited to line of sight, and easily jammed. This meant that American escort carriers, even when scattered, could coordinate their planes into swarms, vector fighters to precise threats, and redirect strike aircraft in midair. Radar, too, gave them eyes the Japanese could not match. Air search radars like the SC-2 and later SK units swept the skies for incoming raids. Surface search radars guided destroyers into torpedo runs through smoke and rain. Japanese admirals mocked the small carriers, but what they could not see was the invisible dome of information surrounding them. At Samar, it was radar that first warned Taffy 3 of Kurita's approach, giving them precious minutes to prepare for the onslaught. The aircraft themselves embodied American adaptability. The FM-2 Wildcat, though outclassed in speed and climb by Japan's Zero, was rugged, heavily armed with 6.50 caliber machine guns, and capable of absorbing punishment. On escort carriers, Wildcats were the shield, scrambling to intercept attackers, strafing decks, and harassing cruisers. The TBM Avenger was the sword. Designed as a torpedo bomber, it carried payloads of 2,000 pounds. Against battleships, it could drop armor-piercing bombs. Against cruisers, torpedoes. Against destroyers, depth charges if nothing else remained. The flexibility of these planes meant escort carriers could launch strikes against virtually any target. In technical terms, an escort carrier was inferior to a fleet carrier in almost every way. But in practical terms, it was enough. Enough to cover convoys, enough to provide close air support during amphibious assaults, enough to turn the tide of a battle if wielded with courage. Their very ordinariness concealed their true strength. They were expendable. Losing one was tragic, but the Navy could replace it in weeks. This expendability freed their commanders and crews to take risks unthinkable for a fleet carrier. At Samar, it was this willingness to fight beyond design limits that stunned the Japanese. The Japanese Navy, by comparison, clung to the behemoths of another age. Battleships like Yamato and Musashi, with their 18.1-inch guns, were marvels of naval engineering, floating fortresses designed to obliterate opponents at ranges beyond sight. They bristled with armor feet thick, propulsion systems capable of hurling them through the waves at 27 knots, and the firepower to smash cities. Yet all this magnificence was useless against an enemy that refused to stand still, that attacked from the sky, that coordinated unseen. In engineering terms, Yamato represented the zenith of battleship design. But escort carriers, in their crude simplicity, represented the future. The numbers tell the story starkly. Yamato required nearly 3,000 men to crew her, consuming immense amounts of fuel, thousands of tons of oil per day, at full steam. A Casablanca-class escort carrier sailed with just 860 men, sipped fuel compared to the Leviathans, and could be built for a fraction of the cost. While Japan poured resources into a few massive warships, the U.S. churned out carriers by the dozen, each carrying planes that could strike hundreds of miles away. In naval arithmetic, it was not size that mattered, it was multiplication. Factories in Detroit, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh fed the war machine. General Motors and Eastern Aircraft mass-produced Avengers and Wildcats. Steel mills poured out decks and beams. Motorola and Western Electric manufactured radios by the tens of thousands. Each escort carrier was a floating symbol of America's industrial strength, its decks filled with machines born of assembly lines rather than artisan yards. Against this tidal wave of production, Japan, limited by resources and blockaded supply lines, could not compete. Yet perhaps the most remarkable technical advantage of the escort carriers was psychological. Their crews knew they were fragile. They knew one shell could destroy them. And so, they operated with a constant edge, a readiness to improvise. At Samar, this mindset turned desperation into ingenuity. Aircraft launched without proper payloads, armed with whatever could be found, depth charges, even empty strafing runs. Destroyer crews fired torpedoes at impossible ranges and charged battleships with suicidal courage. In the end, the escort carriers were not just machines. They were catalysts, turning ordinary sailors into legends. The Japanese had mocked them as baby flattops, scoffing at their short decks and thin skins. But in technical reality, they were something more dangerous. They were proof that in modern war, innovation, production, and adaptability could eclipse tradition, pride, and brute strength. Where Japan built monuments to naval glory, the United States built tools for victory. And those tools, humble though they seemed, would bleed the Imperial Navy dry. September 1944. The skies over eastern France hung heavy with mist as dawn broke over the Lorraine countryside. In the fields near the small town of Escort, German armor rolled forward with grim purpose. Panthers and Panzer IVs, painted in muted camouflage, moved across the open ground in a formation that once struck terror into the hearts of Europe. Their commanders believed this would be another crushing blow against green American forces. Yet what unfolded in those days would prove otherwise. For here too the humble escort carriers' land-based cousins, the doctrine of improvisation and the spirit of adaptability, echoed across the theater of war. But the true crucible of the escort carriers, the moment that defined them forever, came a month later and half a world away at Samar, where their steel decks were tested against the mightiest fleet Japan had left. It began at 6:37 a.m. On October 25, 1944. Lookouts aboard the USS Gambier Bay, flagship of Taffy 3, spotted the silhouettes first. Black against the rising sun, the Japanese center force emerged from the San Bernardino Strait like specters of doom. There they were, Yamato, Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna, 4 battleships, bristling with guns so large they could hurl shells over the horizon. Alongside them steamed heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and destroyers, a force of over 20 warships bearing down on 6 escort carriers and their screen of destroyers. The Americans were outgunned, outnumbered, and outclassed. The battle that followed would be chaos incarnate, and yet, against all logic, the impossible would happen. The first Japanese salvos erupted, geysers of water rising around Gambier Bay. She twisted desperately, her light hull shuddering from near misses. Pilots scrambled from bunks, racing to their aircraft even as shells slammed into the sea. Deck crews worked with frantic urgency, launching Avengers and Wildcats as fast as possible, some planes barely fueled, some carrying nothing but machine gun ammo. There was no time to arm properly. Every second counted. At 8:07 a.m., Commander Ernest Evans of USS Johnston made his fateful decision. Knowing his ship stood no chance in a gunnery duel, Evans chose offense. Johnston surged forward, charging directly at the Japanese cruisers. Her guns barked in defiance, her torpedoes armed. The crew could scarcely believe it, one destroyer against the might of an empire. Evans' voice thundered through the intercom. "This will be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way." And with that, Johnston unleashed her torpedoes. A Japanese cruiser swerved violently, narrowly avoiding destruction. Chaos rippled through the Japanese line as ships veered off course. The destroyer hull followed suit, lashing out with torpedoes before succumbing to withering fire. The tiny destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, nicknamed the Sammy B., charged like a terrier at a pack of wolves, closing to point-blank range against cruisers that dwarfed her. She fired until her guns ran dry, hammering enemy armor with shells that sparked but rarely penetrated. Still, she fought, her crew buying time with their lives. One by one, these small ships fell silent, blasted apart by overwhelming firepower, but each sacrifice sowed greater confusion. Above, the skies filled with the roar of American aircraft. Avengers dove low, dropping depth charges on battleships, the explosions startling but rarely damaging. Wildcats strafed bridges and gun crews, forcing Japanese sailors to take cover. Planes made multiple attack runs, even unarmed, swooping again and again to create the illusion of endless air power. Pilots radioed false reports of heavy strikes inbound, amplifying the deception. To Kurita, it seemed he faced the full weight of American carriers. He could not know that these Jeep carriers were fighting with empty racks and pure audacity. By 8 a.m., Gambier Bay's luck had run out. Japanese cruisers closed in, their shells hammering her thin hull. Fires spread across her decks, her list grew, and at last she rolled, her crew spilling into the sea. She was the only American carrier ever sunk by surface gunfire. Yet her death was not in vain. Every minute she held had allowed more planes to launch, more strikes to harass, and more confusion to spread. The battle raged on in a swirling storm of smoke and flame. American destroyers laid smoke screens so dense the sea became a gray wall, hiding carriers from Japanese sights. Out of this fog, torpedo tracks cut like knives, forcing battleships to turn away, breaking their formations. Japanese captains, unnerved by phantom aircraft and relentless torpedoes, radioed frantic warnings of massive American fleets. Reports clashed. Certainty dissolved. At 9:20 a.m., Kurita received word that his ships were under constant attack, that enemy carriers were everywhere, and that his force was being whittled down. In truth, the Japanese had lost only a few ships, but perception, not reality, ruled the moment. Kurita, fearing he had stumbled into a trap, ordered withdrawal. The mighty center force, with battleships and cruisers capable of annihilating the Leyte invasion, turned away. The gamble of Shogo collapsed, undone not by fleet carriers or battleships, but by escort carriers and destroyers that refused to break. The butcher's bill was heavy. The Americans lost 2 escort carriers, Gambier Bay and St. Lo, 3 destroyers, and hundreds of men. But the Japanese lost something greater, their chance to alter the war. St. Lo's death was apocalyptic. The first ship in history sunk by a kamikaze as a Zero plunged into her deck, igniting bombs and fuel in a chain reaction that ripped her apart. Flames roared into the sky, yet even in destruction, her sacrifice was part of the greater victory. The aftermath was staggering. Kurita retreated with most of his ships intact, but his spirit broken. The Japanese high command had gambled everything on Leyte Gulf. Without victory there, their empire's fate was sealed. Escort carriers, mocked as baby Flattops and derided as auxiliaries, had stood before the mightiest battleships ever built and forced them to flee. Eyewitnesses struggled to describe what they had seen. Survivors spoke of walls of water, skies filled with fire, and men charging battleships with nothing but grit. Admiral Sprague, commander of Taffy III, later wrote of his astonishment. In no engagement of its entire history has the United States Navy shown more gallantry, guts, and gumption than in the action off Samar. Numbers tell part of the story. Taffy III's 6 escort carriers launched just 450 sorties that morning, many of them unarmed or improvised. The Japanese fleet boasted 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers, a force whose combined weight of fire should have obliterated the Americans. Yet the butcher's bill for Japan was steep. 3 cruisers sunk, 4 more heavily damaged, and a retreat that squandered their last real chance at decisive victory. It was an unequal fight by every measure, except spirit. The escort carriers had no right to win. Yet they did, through deception, courage, and improvisation. The battle off Samar became legend, immortalized as the day when small ships faced giants and refused to bow. For the Japanese admirals who once mocked them, the lesson was cruel. Their fleets had been turned back not by America's finest carriers or battleships, but by auxiliaries they had dismissed as irrelevant. Pride had blinded them, and in that blindness, they had been defeated. The smoke of Samar drifted long after the guns had fallen silent, curling across a sea littered with burning oil, shattered timbers, and the cries of survivors. To the American sailors who had endured it, the battle was more than survival, it was revelation. The smallest ships, those deemed expendable, had forced the greatest battleships in history to turn back. This victory was not just tactical, it was psychological, strategic, and symbolic. It changed the way the U.S. Navy viewed itself, and it shook the Japanese high command to its core. For the Americans, the lesson was visceral. Escort carriers, derided as jeep carriers, had stood in the crucible of battle and emerged as war winners. Their strength was not in armor, speed, or guns, but in their ability to connect, adapt, and fight as one. Crews who had once thought of themselves as second-line auxiliaries discovered that courage and ingenuity could elevate their fragile decks into the equal of any fleet carrier. The effect rippled through the Navy. If 6 escort carriers and a handful of destroyers could turn back Yamato herself, then no American ship, no matter how humble, could ever be dismissed again, strategically. Samar preserved the lifeline of the Pacific War. Had Kurita smashed into Leyte Gulf, thousands of American transports, packed with troops, supplies, fuel, and ammunition, would have been annihilated. The invasion might have collapsed. The liberation of the Philippines could have been delayed by months, perhaps years. Worse still, a decisive Japanese victory might have emboldened Tokyo, strengthened its bargaining position, and prolonged the war indefinitely. Instead, the Japanese retreat ensured MacArthur's forces secured their beachheads. The island campaign rolled forward, and Japan's empire began to crumble from within. The psychological toll on the Japanese Navy was immense. Kurita's retreat was seen by many in Tokyo as a failure of will. Though those who had faced the storm at Samar understood the truth, they had been beaten not by numbers, but by audacity. Kurita himself later admitted that confusion clouded his judgment. Reports of endless waves of aircraft, the smoke-shrouded sea, and the relentless torpedo attacks convinced him he faced a far larger force. He feared annihilation, and in that fear lay the end of Japanese naval supremacy. For the first time, battleships had turned away from battle, not because they were destroyed, but because their commanders believed they could not win. For the sailors of the Imperial Navy, the impact was corrosive. Once, they had believed in the invincibility of their ships, the divine aura of Yamato, and the iron tradition of decisive battle. At Samar, that belief cracked. To be driven back by baby Flattops was humiliation layered upon defeat. Survivors whispered of phantom fleets, of endless American planes that could not possibly have been real. In truth, they had been overwhelmed not by steel, but by illusion, by the invisible threads of American coordination. It was a truth harder to swallow than any shell or torpedo in broader strategic terms. Samar signaled the death of the battleship as arbiter of naval war. Yamato and her sisters had been conceived in an era when gun duels decided empires. At Leyte, their guns thundered, their shells roared, but they could not kill what they could not reach. Aircraft from escort carriers, however small, could strike from miles away, endlessly harassing, endlessly returning. The great lesson was clear. In the modern sea war, mobility and air power mattered more than armor and caliber. Samar was the final nail in the coffin of the decisive battle doctrine that had guided Japan since Tsushima. The psychological contrast between the two navies was stark. American sailors felt a surge of pride and unity. Survivors of Johnston, Hull, and Samuel B. Roberts remembered their captain's words, their sacrifices, and their refusal to yield. The destroyer that fought like a battleship became a rallying cry, proof that courage could bend the arc of history. In wardrooms and training schools, Samar was retold as a parable of grit, reinforcing the Navy's faith in initiative and improvisation. It became part of the very culture of the fleet. For the Japanese, Samar was a wound that never healed. Kurita's withdrawal haunted the Imperial Navy. Critics whispered that had he pressed on, he might have destroyed the invasion fleet. Others argued that his hesitation saved his force from certain annihilation by Halsey's returning carriers. But all agreed that the aura of Japanese naval supremacy was gone. Pride had given way to doubt, and in war, doubt is lethal. On the ground in the Philippines, the psychological impact was equally profound. American soldiers at Leyte, bracing for the thunder of battleships, instead saw the Japanese retreat. Word spread quickly. The invasion fleet had survived, thanks to the escort carriers and their destroyer guardians. For troops already locked in brutal jungle combat, the news was a surge of morale. They knew now that the Navy would not let them be abandoned, that even the smallest ships would bleed to protect them. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, despair deepened. The loss at Leyte Gulf, of which Samar was the most dramatic episode, signaled the effective end of the Japanese Navy as an offensive force. Carriers were gone, their pilots dead, their battleships impotent. What remained was desperation. Within hours of St. Lo's destruction by a kamikaze, Japanese high command embraced organized suicide attacks as official doctrine. Escort carriers had shown that conventional battle could no longer deliver victory. From that moment on, Japan would rely on death as a weapon. Strategically, Samar ensured the path to Japan's home islands was clear. With the Philippines secured, American bombers gained forward bases to strike Taiwan, Okinawa, and eventually Japan itself. Oil from Southeast Asia was cut off, starving the Japanese fleet. In this way, the jeep carriers that had been mocked ended up strangling the very heart of the empire. But perhaps the deepest impact was symbolic. Samar overturned centuries of naval tradition. It proved that the measure of a ship was not in its armor, nor its guns, nor its prestige, but in its ability to adapt, to coordinate, and to inspire. It proved that sailors armed with radios, torpedoes, and sheer will could face the largest battleships in history and survive. And it proved that in modern war, psychological shock could matter as much as material loss. Kurita retreated not because his ships were destroyed, but because his spirit was broken. For the Americans, Samar became a legend. For the Japanese, it became shame. Between those two truths lay the turning point of naval history. The escort carriers, once mocked, had not only saved an invasion, they had rewritten the rules of war in the months after Samar. The Pacific Ocean grew quieter for the Imperial Japanese Navy. Its great gamble at Leyte had failed, and with it, the last realistic hope of halting America's relentless advance. Escort carriers, once laughed at in Tokyo war councils, now sailed the seas with a new reputation. They were not auxiliaries, but frontline instruments of victory. The legacy of their defiance stretched far beyond the battle itself, shaping the final months of the Second World War and echoing into every conflict that followed. The most immediate consequence was strategic collapse. With the Philippine sea lanes cut, Japan's access to oil from Borneo and Sumatra withered. The warships that had retreated from Samar soon became floating prisons, massive hulls without fuel to move them. Yamato herself, pride of the fleet, symbol of imperial strength, would spend most of her final months idle, her guns silent, her bulk rusting at anchor. When she finally sailed in April 1945, it was a one-way mission, Operation Tengo, a suicide run toward Okinawa, where she was obliterated by American aircraft before ever sighting the shore. Escort carriers had played their part in writing that epitaph. By holding the line at Samar, they had ensured Japan's great fleet would die not in triumph, but in futility. For the United States, the legacy of escort carriers was one of doctrine and philosophy. Naval strategists saw clearly that size was no longer the measure of power. The great battleships, once the arbiters of naval supremacy, had been made obsolete not only by fleet carriers, but even by their smaller cousins. What mattered was the ability to deliver aircraft wherever needed, in overwhelming numbers, with coordination and adaptability. The lesson was brutal, but it was undeniable. Mobility and connectivity trumped mass and armor in practical terms. Escort carriers became the backbone of American amphibious warfare. Dozens of them supported landings at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, their Wildcats and Avengers swooping down to strafe beaches, suppress artillery, and guard against kamikazes. They lacked the glamour of Essex-class carriers, but their contribution was immense. For every iconic flag raised atop Mount Suribachi, escort carriers had been overhead, providing cover. For every soldier who made it ashore alive, there had been a baby flattop, watching from the horizon. Psychologically, their story inspired generations of sailors. The saga of Johnston, Hull, and Samuel B. Roberts became touchstones of naval courage, tales told in training schools and wardrooms for decades. The phrase "the destroyer that fought like a battleship" entered legend, a reminder that valor could eclipse tonnage. Escort carrier crews, once resigned to second-class status, carried their new identity with pride. They had been underestimated, but in the crucible of combat, they had proven themselves equal to any warship afloat. For the Japanese, the legacy was harsher. The defeat at Samar symbolized the failure of a doctrine rooted in prestige and tradition. Battleships and heavy cruisers, once the ultimate instruments of naval dominance, had been rendered irrelevant by aircraft launched from what they considered little more than merchant conversions. The psychological blow was immense. Never again would Japanese admirals look upon jeep carriers with mockery. Instead, they became symbols of a war Japan could not win, because it had failed to see the future. That future extended far beyond 1945. In the Cold War, the United States Navy applied Samar's lessons with relentless precision. Communications, coordination, and mass production became cornerstones of strategy. Fleet carriers remained queens of the sea, but escort carriers lived on in new forms, helicopter assault ships, amphibious assault carriers, and light carriers that carried vertical takeoff jets. The principle was the same: flexibility over grandeur, numbers over monuments. Even in later conflicts, echoes of Samar resounded. In Korea, escort carriers provided close air support at Incheon, just as they had at Leyte. In Vietnam, they flew helicopters and strike aircraft from offshore, adapting again to new roles. By the time of the Gulf War in 1991, the doctrine of connectivity, radios, satellites, instant coordination, had matured into something Kurita could never have imagined. American forces struck Iraq with networked precision, fleets of ships, aircraft, and ground units fighting as one organism. Just as Taffy III had fought 47 years earlier, the irony was sharp. Japan had built the largest battleships in history, monuments of steel and pride, but they had been defeated by ships built on the cheap, in weeks, from merchant hulls. It was the triumph of pragmatism over prestige, of adaptability over arrogance. Naval historians would later write that Yamato symbolized the end of an age, while escort carriers symbolized the birth of another. Yet the legacy was not only strategic. It was human. Survivors of Taffy III remembered the faces of shipmates who had stood against impossible odds, who had fired until their guns melted, and who had charged into torpedo runs knowing they would not return. Their stories became part of naval tradition, reminders that courage was not measured in calibers or tonnage. Families of the fallen spoke of pride, of grief, and of the strange comfort that their loved ones had stood at the turning of history. Veterans gathered for reunions, telling younger generations of the day when the smallest ships of the fleet stood tallest, and in Japan, the legacy carried its own weight. Survivors of Kurita's fleet spoke of confusion, disbelief, and even shame. They admitted that what had defeated them was not firepower, but spirit and deception. Some would later say Samar taught them humility, a bitter lesson in the dangers of underestimation. The mocking words, "baby flattops," would never be spoken again. In the end, the escort carrier's legacy is a paradox. They were fragile, expendable, and unglamorous, yet their impact was monumental. They were mocked as auxiliaries, yet they shaped the war's outcome. They were meant to ferry planes, yet they fought battleships and won. Their legacy is not written in tonnage or displacement, but in courage and connection. Naval history is filled with mighty ships, Hood, Bismarck, and Yamato, whose names echo with power. Yet it was the humble escort carriers, the overlooked jeep carriers, that delivered one of the war's most decisive blows. Their story is a reminder that greatness is not always born of grandeur. Sometimes, it is forged in desperation, in smoke and fire, in the courage of ordinary men on extraordinary decks, and so the lesson endures. In modern war, connection outweighs firepower. Speed and adaptability defeat armor and prestige. The smallest vessel, when wielded with courage and coordination, can humble the mightiest fleet. The waves off Samar whisper that truth still: never underestimate the underestimated.